As a nutrition-focused doctor, a question that I hear all the time from people is olive oil or butter better for you? In this video, I will be breaking down for you 3 important pros and cons for you to think about to understand what are some of the differences between having butter or olive oil in your cooking, your diet, and your health. And throughout the video, I'm going to sprinkle in some little nuggets and things for you to think about and understand so that you can make the best decision for your health. As if that is not tasty enough, I want you to stick with me until the end, where I'm going to be presenting you with a challenge, an easy way for you to boost your health, decrease your risk of cardiovascular disease by doing one simple thing. If you're new to my channel, hey, I'm Dr. Anna. I'm a medical doctor. I was trained in Italy, in the heart of the Mediterranean region. And this channel is all about bringing you nutrition, wellness, and healthy habits so that you can make being healthy easy and feel amazing in your body and thus in your life. Okay, so our first pro and con that we need to tackle head on in the debate of olive oil versus butter. First, we need to understand the functionality differences between these two ingredients. Now, most people, when they think of olive oil, they think of it in a cooking sense, and butter can be used both in cooking, but more so in baking. Now, the reasons for that have to do with the molecular chemistry of these fats. We're not going to get into the weeds of food science in this video, but understanding when certain things can be substituted and when they can't is super important to decide whether you want to use olive oil or butter, or even a different fat. So for example, if you wanted to bake cookies, olive oil really isn't the best thing to use. You do want to have something like a butter in that kind of a recipe. But when it comes to cooking vegetables, meat, or fish, these two can really be substituted. One of the nice added benefits of olive oil over butter is that because it's liquid at room temperature, it is the perfect salad dressing. So if you're trying to decrease a lot of processed things in your diet, there is no better way to dress a salad than with something acidic and olive oil. So you can pair olive oil with any kind of a vinegar, like a balsamic or a red wine vinegar, or just use a squeeze of lemon. Pro and con number 2, the difference in the nutrition of these two fats. Now, it's really important to understand at a very basic level the differences in different types of fats because they have different effects on our health, specifically our cardiovascular health. Olive oil, or extra virgin olive oil, some people call it EVOO, is so healthy because it has all of these monounsaturated fats. Now, you really don't need to know what that means. It's really the structure of the molecule and how the bonds are formed. You don't need to know the specifics of the molecular chemistry to be able to reap the benefits of this oil. What we know is that monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats give us a benefit of decreasing our risk for cardiovascular disease, including things like atherosclerosis, the fatty plaque that builds up inside of our blood vessels. It can cause clots, clog it up, which can lead to heart attacks. On the other hand, butter is mostly a saturated fat. Now, there are some unsaturated fatty acids inside of butter, but about 70% of the oil in butter is of the saturated type. Now, we know from a lot of different research studies that look at huge populations of thousands of people and tons of data, those saturated fats increase somebody's risk for cardiovascular disease. So it's really important to distinguish the two. There are differences in the way their chemistry is that directly affects our health. Now, for those of you who are a little bit nerdy about the science and the data that does exist, there is some differences in opinion when it comes to exactly how much of each type of fat is going to have what effect on our risk for these cardiovascular diseases. But the data is clear about one thing. That one thing is that you should have more monounsaturated fat in your diet than saturated fat. More simply, more of the unsaturated fats than the saturated fats will help decrease your risk for cardiovascular disease. But I want to make something very clear for all of you. Both butter and olive oil are nutritious for your body. So it's not really an all this or all that thing when it comes to the nutrition debate. You just want to think about the proportions of these things in your diet overall. Now, I want to give you something else to think about when it comes to the nutrition. A lot of the data that we have about nutrition in general comes from types of studies called epidemiological studies. That is a big fancy word for saying we are studying huge groups of people at one time. So an entire population, thousands of people at once. A lot of studies that are looking from an epidemiological lens about the nutrition show regions of the world around the Mediterranean region that have a high consumption of olive oil tend to have lower levels of a lot of chronic diseases, including cardiovascular disease. And those populations tend to have an average age or an average lifespan that is longer. So these people are living longer and with less disease. That is a big reason why we often conclude in medicine that having olive oil in your diet is really healthy for you, because regions of the world that consume a lot of olive oil tend to have better health outcomes. That's important to distinguish in our minds of how and why we know some of this stuff. But if you're like me and you don't want to pick butter or olive oil, I'm telling you, you don't have to pick. You can have both. But it's all about the ratio. You do want to have more unsaturated fat than saturated fat in your diet overall. That is absolutely clear. And I have a really amazing tip for you. So, oh my gosh, I don't know anything about chemistry. You might be thinking, how am I gonna figure out what's an unsaturated fat, what's a saturated fat? I'm gonna give you an awesome trick that I learned when I was in nutrition school. So different oils have different chemical properties. And what that means is some of them can be a solid at room temperature, or about 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and other fats are liquid at room temperature. The reasons that they are either solid or liquid has to do with its chemistry. And a good rule of thumb is that if a fat or an oily substance is solid at room temperature, it's more likely saturated fat. So what are examples of this? Butter, coconut oil, lard, tallow, which is the fat from beef. Coming from my culture, we talk about schmaltz all the time, which is the fat from chicken. And all of those fats become solid at room temperature. You have to heat them above room temperature to get them to that liquid form. And a good way that you're going to detect this is, let's say you grilled some meat or you cooked something that had red meat or chicken or something inside of it, and then you had some leftovers and you put them in the fridge overnight. When you take them out of the fridge and it's still cold, notice how it has that kind of milky white layer on top. Well, that's the saturated fat that's solidified at the colder temperature. So if you're wondering if something has saturated fat, check and see if at room temperature or even the temperature inside of your fridge, it turns to that milky white substance. Something like an olive oil is going to need to be a lot colder until it becomes solid. And that's because of the chemical properties inside of unsaturated fats. So if you're wanting to make sure you are doing the best that you can at decreasing your risk for heart disease and keeping your health as balanced as possible, go for those liquid fats. Those are probably going to protect your heart better. Okay, so pro and con number 3, the flavor profile difference. Now, olive oil is really complex and there's a lot of varieties of it. There are actually some olive oil tastings that you can do, kind of like a wine tasting where people smell it and then they drink it and they say, it's nutty, it's floral, it's woody, it's herby. So olive oil is very complex and very diverse in its flavor. Butter is a little bit less complex and I would argue less diverse in its aromas, but it's always really good. Notice how butter is a little bit sweeter tasting than olive oil. And that's partly because there is sugar inside of butter and it's the lactose. So something to think about is that if you want to add a sweetness to maybe what you're cooking or you're doing some baking, it makes sense to use butter in that circumstance. Whereas if you're trying to toss a salad or you're gonna grill some meat and you want to have something that's saltier or briny or just less sweet in general, olive oil makes a lot more sense for that. Now, a cool thing to know is that the caramelization process is the process when you're putting sugar at a higher temperature, it becomes brown, and that actually increases the sweetness more. Now, a little bit of the chemistry. The reason for that is because you're actually extracting some water, or rather, water's evaporating out of the molecule when you're heating it. And so the sugar inside of it does what's called caramelize. It gets brown and it gets a little sweet and nutty. Olive oil doesn't caramelize because there's really no sugar in olive oil. It's pure. My tip to you when thinking about the flavor profile and the differences between when you might want to use olive oil or when you might want to use butter is that there's a lot of variety you can get from olive oil by either heating it up or leaving it at room temperature. I talked about this before, but it's so perfect as a salad dressing because raw, you can just drizzle it on. You can put it over grilled vegetables or sauteed. You can also just drizzle it on meat. There's nothing wrong with that. I know it sounds strange to us in the US, but a typical thing in Italy is to have a big T-bone steak with a squeeze of lemon, olive oil, and big chunky salt. And that's how they have their steak. There's no A1 sauce, there's no slab of butter. It's olive oil all the way. All right, so those were our 3 pros and cons. And now we're gonna get into the challenge. And I want to challenge you guys by thinking about some of the things we just learned about the chemistry of these different fats, unsaturated versus saturated, and how that impacts our health. The effects on the risk of cardiovascular disease or getting clogged up arteries that can eventually lead to big problems like a heart attack. And I want to challenge you by trying to think about which kinds of oils you gravitate towards or you reach for when you're in the kitchen. Are you reaching for butter or are you reaching for olive oil? Now, I want to challenge you by suggesting that for the next week, if you typically use butter for something, try to flip the equation and instead use olive oil for that thing. You might be thinking, that is not so easy to do, Dr. Anna. How am I going to just swap it out? Well, I'm here to tell you that there really are no rules. I told you that in some parts of the world, like in Italy, they put olive oil on a steak. You can drizzle it on any meat you can think of. You can also cook with it. You can even bake with it. You can make an olive oil cake. I promise you're gonna like it. But just be careful that you don't do a direct swap out in a baked good because it might mess up the chemistry of that actual recipe. It's better to look up a recipe for an olive oil cake, olive oil muffins, for example. But try to do one switch out, or more than one if you're really up for the challenge, because think about this. Every time you can substitute saturated for unsaturated fats in your diet, you are further decreasing your risk for cardiovascular disease. The ratio is what's important. We want more unsaturated than saturated fats. So go challenge yourself, try to swap it out, go for that EVU, and then tell me in the comments what you did, and did it work or did it not work? Was it a total flop, or is this something that's totally changing the way that you're thinking about cooking with fat? So while you are considering all of the ways that olive oil is helping to decrease your risk for heart disease, I want you to check out this video right here. And I talk about several other ways that olive oil and the Mediterranean diet are boosting your health and decreasing your risk for disease. There are things like a decreased risk of type 2 diabetes, improvement in your brain function, the ability for you to live longer when you eat something like a Mediterranean diet approach, and so many others. You're going to love these health benefits. Dive in so that you can supercharge your health right now.